All right, let's continue with our video lecture for chapter 14, dealing with the Americas. Now we're going to look at Mesoamerica, where we see the Aztecs up and running. So let's begin with the origins of the Aztecs. So the Aztecs originally, they came from northern Mexico, kind of like on the border between Mexico and the modern United States. And they were known as the Mexica, and they kind of like teamed up with other tribes, and they formed an alliance, right? It was the Mexica with two other tribes, and as a whole, these three tribes who created this alliance were eventually known as the Aztecs. So, like any other empire, they began to conquer their neighbors, right? So the Aztecs are going to establish an empire, right? They're going to be the first empire that we see in Mesoamerica, because before the Aztecs, you had, city-states like Teotihuacan, and you had a loose collection of kingdoms or city-states, which is, the Mayans. And before then, it was like a few cities here and there, which were the Olmecs. But we never had an empire, right? So the Aztecs were the first empire of Mesoamerica. And their capital, called Tenochtitlan, was built like literally on a swamp, right? And so that means that they had to do a lot of hydraulic engineering in order to create the city basically in the middle of a swamp. And the end result is that Tenochtitlan would become not only the capital, but the largest, most populous city in all of the Americas. And it was one of the largest in the world, especially when you compare it to like some of the smaller European cities. So again, they were nomadic people. They migrated, they settled down, they conquered their neighbors, and they ruled over most of Mesoamerica. Now, the Aztec government and society is up next. The Aztecs, they were a theocracy. So the priest had a high status in this society, and the emperor was considered a representative of the gods. So that means that the Aztec religion and the Aztec government were combined. The emperor, however, he was not a god. He was not divine, but definitely, divinely chosen. And they were a militaristic society, so they loved war and conflict and combat. And when they would conquer their neighbors, they would force their neighbors to pay tribute. All right, so similar what like the Tang Chinese used to do. They would, force tribute payments from places like Korea and Vietnam and Tibet, right? The Aztecs used to do the same thing, right, to their neighbors. But instead of just paying like luxury goods, sometimes they would have to like pay tribute in food, like food supply, corn and stuff like that, crops, or they would have to pay tribute in the form of military service, where the people that have been conquered now have to be part of the Aztec army. Here we see a picture of the city of Tenochtitlan, right? And you can notice that there's a lot of waterways, and that's again because it was built on a swamp. So that means that they had to like pump out a lot of water in order to like drain the swamp and be able to have stable foundation to build housings and other structures. Of course, you kind of see it right here in the background in the end, how they had pyramids, right? These pyramids were their temples and their palaces, and of course they were going to be in the center of the city. So the Aztec emperors, right, they would wear fancy hairdresses and clothing and feathers, right? These are the type of luxury goods. Jewelry made of, precious stones. The jewelry also sometimes would be made of gold and silver, so they knew how to work those metals. And one of the most famous, because he happens to be the last emperor, is this guy called Montezuma. And he was the last emperor. So here we see the Aztecs, right? That's in central Mexico, right in the middle of Mesoamerica. So they originated probably from up here, right, in the northern part of Mexico. They settled down in this middle part, and they would conquer it. Now, at the same time that the Aztec is up and running, keep in mind that the Mayans are still kind of there, right? The Mayans, even though their major cities like Chichen Itza would have been depopulated, right, de-urbanized because of the environmental problems they had, the Mayans were still living in southern Mexico, right, and in Central America, and the Yucatan Peninsula. But definitely the Aztecs would control. So even though this was their empire, right, all the surrounding areas would have been tributary states, right, paying tribute to the empire. And the Aztec Empire, we call it an empire, but it's quite small. It is quite small compared to like the caliphates or the Tang and Song Dynasty empire, stuff like that. All right, in this society, the priests were upper class, the warriors were upper class, and it makes sense because it's a theocracy and it's a militaristic society. A lot of commoners, merchants and artists and farmers were commoners. A lot of slaves as well, and these slaves normally they were paid as tributes or they were captured in battle, but also debt criminals. We've seen this before. And these slaves, of course, were used to construct stuff and dig stuff and build stuff. But also the slaves that were captured were used for sacrifice, human sacrifice. Right, so here we see some of the Aztec warriors, right? And you see them, come up in battle dressed up in all these fancy, almost looks like pajamas. The clubs that they're wielding, right? I don't know how many of you can see, but it is on the edges of the club that would be obsidian, right? That sharp volcanic black rock that the people of Mesoamerica had been using since Olmec time, and it was used not only for jewelry, but it would be used as tools and as weapons. Right, the spear would also be tipped with obsidian as well. Right, here we see some of the more other soldiers, and you can imagine that the fancier the costume and the headdress, obviously the higher ranking. So this guy here, obviously, he's going to be some like random, low-level guy, and this guy over here, he's going to be some type of commander. The priests, who carried out the sacrifices, of course, they're going to be of high importance in the society. And here we see the breakdown of the hierarchy of Aztec society. Right, nobles will be in the top, merchants, artisans, slaves at the bottom, and the king, who is also the high priest, because it is a theocracy. Most people were farmers, though, right? Simple farmers. They would sell their surplus goods in the markets in the city, and this is what they would pay as tribute to the government. We mentioned slavery. Here we see some of the slaves being captured. Women were forced to work as well. Like, so women, they had a role, like whether it is producing goods or growing crops, women did have to play a role. And their main role, of course, was mother and wife. Some upper-class women might be educated. Some middle-class women might work in other jobs like merchants and stuff. But overall, they had, even though they played different roles, of course, they didn't have equal status and didn't have that many rights. Now, one of the most unique qualities of Aztec women is this idea of heaven. So the Aztecs believed that there was like numerous kind of like layers or levels to heaven. And the highest level, the highest layer, was reserved for two types of people. And the two types were, the first one is warriors. Right, so an Aztec warrior who goes into battle and dies in combat, dies bravely, dies, displaying his courage, his reward is that he gets to go to the highest level of heaven, of the afterlife for the Aztecs. The other people would be women who died in childbirth. So the idea that women, again, they were lower status, but they were valued, right? They were valued, and they believed that women who died in childbirth is awarded the highest level in the afterlife. Right? So here we see some Aztec women. The Aztecs were incredible when it comes to their manipulation, their interaction with the environment. And we see this in this process, in this technology that they kind of come up with called chinampas. And chinampas is defined as a floating garden, right? A floating garden. So here we see kind of like what it would look like today, right? So remember, they built their city around water, so they had a supply of water. And in order to kind of like maximize the water and the resources and the like the nutrients in the water, they build these gardens, right? And you kind of see it here. So they'll kind of like dredge out the water, and then kind of like build like a container. And you kind of see over here these containers, kind of like little islands, right? And therefore you don't really need to irrigate because the water's literally right next to the plants. And by doing this, they were able to produce an extreme amount of surplus. So this explains why their population grows so huge, right? Even though they don't have that much land, right? They're kind of like maximizing the amount of land, the amount of crops that they can grow with the land that is available. So the Chinampas allows them to have all this crop surplus, which allows them to trade, which allows them to have all these different, labor specializations, and of course allows them to build these huge cities. So the Aztecs were primarily agricultural, but they did trade a lot. They even had a special class of merchants who were responsible for acquiring and trading in luxury goods. Now, the most famous aspect of the Aztecs, of course, is their religion and their culture. And the Aztecs, again, here we see some of these step pyramids that they would have constructed in their capital, which is, of course, modern-day Mexico City. So the most famous practice, of course, human sacrifice is not an invention. The Mayans before them had human sacrifice, and the Olmecs before them, they had blood sacrifice. But the Aztecs believed, like other Mesoamericans, that the blood sacrifice from humans was a necessary action, a necessary offering to pay respect to the gods, right, and to support the gods. And that the gods needed it. If not, they grew angrier, they grew weak, and they could cause mass destruction and end of the world type of thing. So who's getting sacrificed? Mainly was slaves and tributes, right? Mainly people who were unfortunate enough to be sold into slavery or captured in battle. They tended to be sacrificed. And so even though again the Mayans did it before them, but the Aztecs, they kind of took it to a whole nother level. They would have like festivals that were like days and days of just human sacrifice after human sacrifice. You're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands every year. And even though this was all religious, right, there was all religious significance for these sacrifices, make no doubt that this was simply another way for the state, to the empire, the emperor, to display their power, right? Because they could tell their tributary states, their neighbors, hey, we are so powerful that you got to give us people and we're going to kill them. And you can't do anything about it. And if you say no, we'll kill all of you. So the Aztec human sacrifice, even though, again, it has religious justifications, it was also an expression of political power, right? The power of the Aztec state. And these are some of the images of their gods, right? And again, they're not the human gods, they're not the pretty gods of the Greeks and stuff like that. These are pretty violent, monster-looking gods with a lot of animal and nature themes, like serpents and leopards, which is common. Here we see a scene from, I'm sure some of you have seen this film, Apocalypto, and there's a lot of historical issues with that film. But this is what the Aztec sacrifice probably might have looked like, right? And of course, they're doing it on top of the temple so that everyone in the city could get a good show. Human sacrifice, bloody, bloody, bloody. But remember that the Aztecs are the third kind of like generation of culture that we see in Mesoamerica, right? They are the continuation of the Mayans and a continuation of the Olmecs. The Olmecs going back to time period 1. The Mayans are time period 2, which is the classical era, and the Aztecs will be the post-classical era. So some of the continuities is that they have a calendar. They use gold and silver and jade for jewelry. They use obsidian. They have a type of writing, kind of pictograph. Sometimes we call it hieroglyphs, same thing. And they also use a ceremonial rubber ball game, right? Where the losers or the winners, depending on which version you hear, gets killed. So here we see kind of the evolution of the different hieroglyphs or pictographs that we see, from the Mayans to the Olmecs to the Aztecs. All right, let's have the last thing is going to be Aztec Decline. How did it all come crashing down? And it's this guy right there. All right, he is partially or mainly responsible. His name is Hernán Cortés, and in the 1500s, he arrives with an army of Spanish conquistadors. And they will basically bring the entire Aztec Empire down. But by then, the Aztec Empire was already declining. The Aztec Empire didn't last very long, about 300 years. But by the 1400s, at the end of the post-classical era, we see a decline. One part of the decline is that they kind of outgrew their capabilities. Even though they were very successful in producing a surplus, eventually they got to the point that their population grew so huge that it wasn't able to maintain their population anymore, right? The amount of food that they could produce. And it didn't help that they didn't have large, strong animals like horses or oxen or camels or donkeys, right? And they didn't have metal tools to cultivate more land than was already available. So that means that their agricultural production wasn't too efficient. It was great for a long time, but eventually it caught up to them. So that means that their population will start waning, right? Start bringing a lot of problems when you have food shortages. Also, when they continue fighting their neighbors, right, and demanding tribute from their neighbors, those neighbors are going to hate the Aztecs. Hate them. So any opportunity that these neighbors see or is presented to them, they're going to jump on it. Any chance that they can get to kick out the Aztecs and stop sending their people to get sacrificed and stop sending food supplies or stop sending luxury goods, they're going to jump on it. So when the Europeans show up, when the Spanish show up, when the guy, what's his name? Not Pizarro. Hernán Cortés, right? When Hernán Cortés shows up, they're going to be like, yes, we'll join you to help overthrow the Aztecs, because they think, that the Spanish can't be that bad, right? Not compared to these evil Aztecs. So they had agricultural food surplus problems. They had, diplomatic problems with their neighbors, right, who were waiting for, the collapse. But what eventually kind of really messes up the Aztecs is disease. And we're going to talk more about that in time period 4. But disease is going to destroy their population, right? 70, 80, 90% of the Aztec population will die within about a 100-year time period upon the arrival of the Europeans. So the Aztec Empire was already declining, it was weakening by the time the Europeans got here. And the Europeans kind of just put the final nail in the coffin. All right, so next we're going to look at the Incas, but that'll be on video number 3. I'll talk to you then.